It seems, however, that this question is more pressing if one examines more specifically the ways in which those who pursue voluntary poverty must live. For there is one mode of life in which the possessions of each are sold, and on the price all live in common. This indeed seems to have been observed under the apostles in Jerusalem. For it is said in Acts 4:34, as many as were possessors of fields or houses, those who sold them brought the prices of what they sold and laid them at the feet of the apostles. But in this way it does not seem to be efficiently provided for human life. First of all, because it is not easy for many who have great possessions to assume this life. And if the price which is taken from the possessions of a few rich people is compared among many, it will not suffice for a long time. Then, because it is possible and easy for such a price to be lost, either by fraud or by theft or robbery, those who pursue such poverty will therefore remain without the support of life. Again, there are many accidents by which people are forced to change their place. Therefore, it will not be easy to provide for those who must be dispersed in different places, from the price taken from the possessions reduced in common. But there is another way of living, that they have possessions in common, from which each is provided according to his need, as is observed in most monasteries. But even this method does not seem appropriate. For earthly possessions bring anxiety, and because of the procurement of fruits, and for their defense against fraud and violence, and so much the greater and from the greater number must he have concern in proportion as there must be greater possessions, which are sufficient for the support of the greater number. In this way, then, the end of voluntary poverty is lost, to the lesser extent to the many who must be anxious about the possessions to be procured. Again, common property is usually the cause of discord, for those who have nothing in common, like the Spaniards and the Persians, do not seem to quarrel, but those who have something in common at the same time. For this reason, there are also quarrels between brothers. Discord, however, most hinders the relaxation of the mind about the divine, as was said above. It seems, therefore, that this way of life prevents the end of voluntary poverty. But there is still a third way of life, that they live by the labor of their hands who pursue voluntary poverty. Paul the Apostle followed this way of life and left others to observe it by his example and instruction. For it is said in 2 Thessalonians 3:8 that we did not eat bread for free from anyone, but in toil and weariness, working night and day so as not to burden any of you, not as if we had no power, but that we ourselves might give you a form to imitate us. For even when we were with you, we announced this to you, that if anyone does not want to work, he will not eat. But even this way of life does not seem to be appropriate, for manual labor is necessary for the maintenance of life, inasmuch as by it something is acquired. But it seems in vain that anyone, having left what is necessary, should labor to acquire it again. If therefore after voluntary poverty it is necessary to acquire again from where one can support himself by manual labor, it was in vain to let go of all that one had for the maintenance of life. Still, voluntary poverty is recommended in order that by means of it one may be disposed to follow Christ more readily, by this that it frees him from worldly cares. But it seems to require greater care that a man should acquire his livelihood by his own labor, than that he should use what he had for the maintenance of life, and especially if he had moderate possessions, or even some movables, from which he was ready to take the necessary subsistence. It seems, therefore, not to live by the labors of the hands, to be appropriate to the purpose of those who assume voluntary poverty. And to this is added the fact that even the Master, removing from the disciples the concern of earthly things under the similitude of the birds and the lilies of the field, seems to forbid manual labor for them. For he says, "Consider the birds of the air, which neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns." And again, "Consider how the lilies of the field grow. They neither toil nor spin." It seems that even this way of life is insufficient, for there are many who long for the perfection of life, who do not have the ability or skill to be able to pass through life with the labor of their hands, because they have not been nurtured or trained in these things. For in this way the peasants and laborers would be in a better condition to attain the perfection of life than those who spent their time in the pursuit of wisdom and were nourished in riches and pleasures, which they forsook for Christ's sake. It also happens that some who assume voluntary poverty become infirm or are otherwise prevented from working. Thus they would remain destitute of the necessaries of life. Again, the labor of not a little time is sufficient to procure the necessaries of life, which is evident in many who spend all their time in this, yet can scarcely obtain a sufficient support. But if those pursuing voluntary poverty were obliged to obtain their livelihood by manual labor, it would follow that they would spend a greater time of their lives in this kind of work, and consequently they would be hindered from other more necessary activities, which also require a great deal of time, such as the study of wisdom and learning and other such spiritual exercises. And thus, voluntary poverty would hinder the perfection of life more than it would prepare for it. But if someone says that manual labor is necessary to get rid of idleness, this is not sufficient for the purpose. For it would be better to remove idleness by occupations in the moral virtues, which are organically served by wealth, for example, in giving alms and the like, than by manual labor. In addition, it would be in vain to give a policy of poverty to the mere fact that men become poor and refrain from idleness, occupying their lives with manual labor, unless it were given that they should spend their time in more noble exercises than those which are according to the common life of men. But if someone says that manual labor is necessary to satisfy the lusts of the flesh, this is not to the purpose, for we are asking whether it is necessary for those following voluntary poverty to earn their living by manual labor. In addition, it is possible to tame the lusts of the flesh in many other ways, namely by fasting, vigils, and the like. Even the rich, who do not need to work to earn a living, could also use manual labor for this purpose. Another way of living is also found, namely that those who follow voluntary poverty live on what is brought by others, who want to advance to this perfection of voluntary poverty, retaining their riches. And it seems that the Lord observed this manner with his disciples, for it is read in Luke 8 that certain women followed Christ and ministered unto him according to their means. But even this way of life does not seem appropriate, for it does not seem reasonable that a man should let go of his own and live on another's. In addition, it seems inappropriate for someone to take from someone and not repay him anything, for in giving and receiving the equality of justice is preserved. But it can be sustained that those who serve them in some office live on what is brought to them by others. For this reason, the ministers of the altar and the preachers who give doctrine and other divine things to the people do not seem improperly to receive from them the maintenance of life, for the laborer is worthy of his food, as the Lord says, Matthew 10:10. For this reason the apostle says, 1 Corinthians 9, that the Lord ordered those who preach the gospel to live by the gospel, just as those who serve the altar share with the altar. Those, then, who serve the people in any capacity, it seems inappropriate if they receive the necessities of life from the people. Again, this way of life seems to be harmful to others, for there are some who must of necessity be supported by the benefits of others, who because of poverty and infirmity cannot provide for themselves. The benefits of these must be diminished if those who voluntarily assume poverty must be supported by what is given by others, since men are not sufficient, nor are they ready to help a great multitude of the poor. Hence the apostle, 1 Timothy 4, commands that if anyone has a widow belonging to him, he should support her, so that the church may be sufficient for those who are truly widows. It is therefore inappropriate for people who choose poverty to adopt this way of life. Still, for the perfection of virtue, the freedom of the mind is most necessary. For when this is taken away, men easily share in the sins of others, either by consenting expressly, or by praising them by flattery, or at least by disguising them. But a great prejudice to this freedom is generated by the aforesaid mode of living. For it is impossible for a man to be afraid of offending him by whose benefits he lives. Therefore, the aforesaid way of life hinders the perfection of virtue, which is the end of voluntary poverty, and so it does not seem to belong to the voluntarily poor. Further, we do not have the ability to depend on the will of another, but it depends on the will of the giver that he gives of his own. Therefore, it is not sufficiently provided for in the ability to support the life of the poor volunteers through this way of living. In addition, it is necessary that the poor, who must be supported by what is given to them by others, should explain their needs to others and ask for necessities. But begging of this kind makes beggars contemptible and even grievous, for men esteem themselves superior to those who need to be supported by them, and with difficulty most give. It is necessary for those who assume the perfection of life to be held in reverence and loved, so that men may imitate them more easily and emulate the state of virtue. But if the opposite happens, even virtue itself is despised. There is therefore a harmful way of living by beggary in those who, for the sake of the perfection of virtue, voluntarily assume poverty. In addition, for perfect men, not only are evils to be avoided, but also those things which have the appearance of evil. For the apostle says, Romans 12, abstain yourselves from every form of evil. And the philosopher says that a virtuous man must not only shun what is base, but also what seems base. But begging has the appearance of evil, when many beg for gain. Therefore this way of life is not to be assumed by perfect men. Again, to this end the counsel is given concerning voluntary poverty, so that the mind of man, withdrawn from earthly cares, may devote himself more freely to God. But this mode of living by beggary has the greatest concern, for it seems to be of greater concern to acquire other people's than to use one's own. It does not seem, then, that this way of looking at voluntary poverty is appropriate for those who assume it. But if anyone wants to praise begging because of humility, it seems that he is speaking completely irrationally. For humility is praised according to the fact that the earthly height, which consists in riches, honors, fame, and the like, is despised, but not according to the fact that the height of virtue is despised, in respect of which we ought to be magnanimous. Humility would therefore be reprehensible if someone, because of humility, did something that detracted from the height of virtue. But begging detracts from him, both because it is more virtuous to give than to receive, and also because it has an ugly appearance, as has been said. Therefore, begging is not to be praised for its humility. There were also some who said that those who pursued the perfection of life should have no concern either with begging, or with labor, or withholding anything for themselves, but that they should wait for the sustenance of life from God alone. For this reason it is said in Matthew 6:25, "Do not be anxious about your soul, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. And again, do not think about tomorrow." But this seems entirely unreasonable. For it is foolishness to desire an end, and to pass over those things which are ordered to an end. But to the end of eating is directed human concern, by which he secures his livelihood. Those, therefore, who cannot live without eating must have some anxiety about seeking food. In addition, the anxiety of the earthly is not to be avoided, except because it hinders the contemplation of the eternal. But a man cannot live wearing mortal flesh without doing many things by which contemplation is interrupted, such as sleeping, eating, and doing other such things. Nor therefore should we pass over the care of those things which are necessary to life, because of the hindrance of contemplation. A wonderful absurdity also follows, for with equal reason he can say that he does not want to walk, or to open his mouth, to eat, or to flee from a falling stone or a rushing sword, but to wait for God to work, that is to tempt God. The anxiety of diet is therefore not to be entirely discarded.